The mistake beginners make when they first get into language learning is the belief that you need to think or recite or recall your way to understanding a language, when in reality, we have to think about language learning or language as something that exists outside of us that we have to absorb. Our brains are like pattern recognition machines, but they only work once we've taken in enough input to start understanding the pattern. So our ultimate goal in language learning is to take in so much of the language that we're able to recognize its meaning before we even have time to think. Like when one of your old favorite songs come on and you recognize the song before you can actually recall its name. However, we can't just jump into listening to native movies. We have to start at a place we understand and work our way up from there, because things we don't understand are just noise to us. Our brain's not going to know what to do with that information. So we have to start with listening to a very basic form of the language and work our way up from there. This is exactly how I got fluent, and this is going to be how you get fluent. But here's the catch. Starting simple for an absolute beginner is tough because you don't even have a single foothold in the language. Being an absolute beginner can feel like walking into the gym and looking to curl a dumbbell, but they literally don't have a dumbbell light enough for you to curl. And if you've never curled a dumbbell before, you might not even actually know how to do it. What are you supposed to do? When you listen to a new language for the first time as a monolingual adult, what should it feel like? How do you know it's working? How do you know your brain is actually, recording these patterns? How do you know you're improving? So the philosophy behind this tier list we're going to get into is that the absolute beginner phase of language learning should be a mad dash to input. You should do whatever you feel like you need to do to get comfortable just listening to the language, because just listening to the language is the fastest and most efficient way to get an actual durable fluency. Let's get started. All right, the first method on the tier list is pure super beginner comprehensible input content. What this method is just jumping headfirst into listening to the language using a form of the language called super beginner content, absolute beginner content, that's meant for people that truly have no experience with the language. So this is very slow speech with lots of visual support, made for absolute beginners. And I'm gonna give this a B tier. This is really the simplest on-ramp to becoming fluent in a language, because it's just doing the thing that I said was the most efficient thing to do, which is just listen to the language. With some languages like Spanish, they do have dumbbells that you can just start lifting from day one. They have very, very light dumbbells. Now, the biggest criticism people are gonna have about super beginner content is a criticism that I actually don't share. I have some criticisms, which I'll get to later, which is why it's a B, but the main one I disagree with. People are gonna say it's inefficient. The reason most people think it's inefficient is because they measure efficiency by how many words there are. Super beginner content is just too slow. There's not enough words per minute. Now, it might be inefficient if you actually feel understimulated. But if you're listening to the language, the biggest thing you have to remember is you're not just learning words. You're not just learning grammar. You're associating words with other words, and you're associating words with other concepts. That's what actually builds a deep intuitive understanding of a language. It's not just that you're collecting a set of definitions. It's that you're learning to recognize words by what they're surrounded by. When you're listening to super beginner content, every time you encounter a word, you can think of all the context you're seeing and hearing pouring into that word. And that's what helps you actually recognize meaning, not just recall the definitions of words when you see them. And that skill, recognition, is what helps you understand words in your target language like you understand words in your native language, where I say a word and you just know what I'm saying. You don't even have to think about the word. In fact, a lot of words in your native language, probably 99% of them, you don't know the definitions for. So when we're trying to learn another language and we want real-time comprehension and real comfortable understanding like we have in our native language, well, it's important to construct our understanding of our second language in a very similar way, or if not the exact same way as our native language. And that's what listening to the language at a level you understand does in general. Now, some people after hearing that are gonna wonder, well, then why isn't super beginner content an A instead of a B? Because I gave it a B, right? But the idea is that monolingual adults, we're gonna find it really hard to just jump into a new language, especially because we're so used to the perfect clarity of understanding when we listen to our own native language. It can feel very difficult to jump headfirst into another language knowing absolutely nothing. If you're somebody with naturally high tolerance for ambiguity and you find super beginner content compelling, then that's for you. That's a great method for you. But what I'm saying is the average person, the average second language learner, is going to have some issues. A lot of people are going to need some translations, some explanations, some grammar rules just to feel comfortable trying to follow along in a foreign language. And because we can't recognize anything, and we also have a low tolerance for ambiguity, just diving right into input can feel like sitting in this deep, dense fog with nothing to hold on to for a long, long time before that recognition builds. And that's where most people are going to have doubts and quit, somewhere between 0 hours of listening to the language and 50 hours of listening to the language. That's the hot spot for people to just drop off, which is why I never personally recommend that you just do pure listening without any support. So that's going to open up a question that I'm going to answer with these next 3 methods on the tier list. The question is, well then, what's the best way of kind of combining our use of translations and our use of explanations with listening, right? What's the best way to kind of massage these together? We're going to start with what I consider to be the worst way to do this. And that's by watching the language you're trying to learn using subtitles in your native language. Just never turning the native subtitles off. I'm going to give this a D tier. The obvious issue with this is it just doesn't train you to get comfortable in a foreign language. You cannot simultaneously read your native language while watching a different language. It's just not possible for the human brain to do. It's like trying to read a book while somebody is reading you another book out loud. The whole point of using a method like this to ease you into listening is to eventually not need it anymore. We have to think about these methods like training wheels. Eventually the point is to take them off. Native subtitles are the worst kinds of training wheels because when you do training wheels, you're trying to just take away one aspect of learning to ride a bike. You're trying to take away that balance aspect, right? But you still have to drive down the street. You have to steer your bike. There are a lot of things you still need to do. Using native language subtitles to me feels like trying to learn to ride a bike using a stationary bike. A stationary bike doesn't even need to move. You don't even need to steer it. You just move your feet. It's not really analogous to handling an actual bike. The kind of support we would want would be support that naturally tapers off. And there's no way to naturally taper off support from a stationary bike. And the worst thing about this method that I've seen from people who generally promote it is they tell you should just go watch native content on Netflix. You should just skip over comprehensible input. Just start watching native TV. And I want to put this in perspective because me, someone who's learned the language for 2.5 years, who's had a girlfriend who spoke no English for more than a year, someone who watches native YouTube content, who can follow native audiobooks. Even for me, it's hard to follow native TV and movies. You're not going to be able to skyrocket your comprehension past me, someone who's done 1,200 hours of comprehensible input, just because you use some English subtitles. Very bad idea. So it gets a D because it's really, really bad at what it's actually trying to do. What we're actually trying to do is get you comfortable listening to the language by itself with no other support. And constant native subtitles really just don't do that well. The one thing that native subtitles actually have going for them is it does give you a pretty clear picture of the content you're watching without you needing to understand the language. So we're going to use that in the next method we're going to look at here. The next method I call subtitle cycling, which is when you watch a video with subtitles in your native language, then you watch it with subtitles in your target language, then you watch it with no subtitles, or some combination of that process. I'm gonna give this an A tier, and I used this a ton when I was an absolute beginner. Now, I know that might confuse people because I just said using native subtitles isn't really understanding the language. Yes, that's true, but using native subtitles is a really efficient way to get the context or the picture or the message of what you're actually watching. In this paradigm, I call watching the content with your native subtitles, I call that a dry run, right? You're not actually really doing much language learning there. What you're really doing is getting context that you can inject into the video to make it easier to understand when you're watching it in your target language without any support. And you can do these cycles with one video as much as you want. What I really like about this is that it trains us to feel comfortable listening to a foreign language just due to the familiarity we have with what we're watching. Because we're doing the dry run and the pure language pass completely separately. So we learn to follow a narrative in another language without having to constantly stop and think and decode each word. What this teaches, in my opinion, is to use translations like background context as opposed to trying to weld them on to each individual word so you can always decode them. And I always want to be clear here for absolute beginners, because in the beginning it probably will feel like decoding, but the point is that it's becoming less and less like decoding and more like recognition. The more times you cycle through a video, the more it starts to feel like you're understanding without any conscious thought. It's a huge confidence builder, and it gets you very familiar with a concentrated set of words instead of overwhelming yourself with videos on all different topics right when you start out. Now, there's two obvious downsides with this method. The first one is the dry runs, right? If we could, we would eliminate the dry runs, and that's what we're trying to do, right? Eventually, what we're trying to do is just do only listening to content in our target language, but these dry runs are easing us in. The other obvious downside is we're gonna overfit our understanding of what we're watching to native subtitles, meaning with this method, we're really only ever gonna get a functional approximation of what we're watching, because there's really no such thing as a perfect translation from one language to another. There's always going to be a good amount of approximation involved, which is why it's important for beginners to understand that your target language is not just your native language dressed in a different costume. It's really a different take on reality. I don't think that concern is very important as long as we understand the nature of direct translation. Now, what makes this method so much better than just permanently using native subtitles is that you get really fine-tuned controls on how much you want to do this, right? You could do one dry run, and then one target language subtitle run, and then one pure run, or you could do 3 dry runs, you could do 10 dry runs, you could do 1 dry run and 10 pure runs. You could cut out the target language subtitle step. You could do whatever you want with this. The point is you could slowly back off as needed until you're comfortable just doing pure runs, just listening to input. And that's what I said we're trying to do, right? We're just trying to get to the point where we can listen to input. And this is a great method to kind of ease you into it at your speed. So the reason it's A tier is you get a strong functional understanding of certain common words. You effectively build your tolerance for ambiguity, and we're still getting that pouring in effect from the context around each word we see. And the only price you pay are the dry runs in your native language. The last method in this group that tries to massage translations and explanations into listening is called, or I would call it, watch and pause. You listen, you get to something you don't understand, you pause, you rewind, you translate, and you listen again. I'm going to give this an A, and from my experience, I think this is probably the most popular method for doing comprehensible input, for listening to the language at a level you understand. And I know it's simple, so most people are like, is this even really a method? But the only reason I'm including it is because a lot of people think, oh, well, to do comprehensible input, to listen to the language, you have to not use translations or not use explanations. I just want to make it clear that I think actually the majority of people are doing this, and I think they're using exactly this method, or a method like this. Now, the obvious problem with this method is there's no agreed upon rule on when to look things up, so I'm going to give you guys my rule. My rule is to use lookups, or translations and explanations, as a life raft, right? You try to understand the input, and if you really can't understand almost anything, if you're like, I have no idea what this says, then you use the translation or the explanation. And if you're wondering my tool of choice to do these lookups, it's obviously LLMs. I would just get GPT. If you're learning a language, I recommend you just do a $20 GPT subscription. It's simple. It's a really easy way to get quick explanations and quick translations, because the reality of translations is you need context, right? Using Google Translate isn't great because every single direct translation depends heavily on, the context of the sentence you're translating or the word you're translating. You can also translate on my website, and what my website has going for it is when you type in a word or phrase to translate, you actually get all the most popular context. So you just type in a word or phrase and you see all the possible things that word or phrase could mean, or at least the most popular meanings. So as I said, I think most people doing comprehensible input are doing some variation of this method, but the difference between people who succeed and fail with the method is that the people who succeed understand the purpose of the lookups, right? The purpose of the lookups is not to improve yourself in the language. The purpose of the lookups is comfort and context. They're not actually the thing that's driving your ability to understand the language. What's driving your ability is taking in input. Or in other words, the lookups simply aren't essential to your language learning. All right, the next method on this list is flashcards. And I'm going to give flashcards a C tier because I just don't think they get you to real-time comprehension efficiently. Or in other words, I just don't think they'll be able to effectively get you to a point where you can just listen to the language. And the reason for this is simply lack of context. When we're listening to a sentence in our native language or our target language, we're not doing this. We're not seeing a word, recalling its meaning, moving on to the next word, seeing that word, recalling its meaning, moving on to the next word. That's not what we're doing. Instead, we're using the context of everything that's come before to make unconscious predictions about what's coming next, to prime ourselves for recognition. I'm going to give you an example of this in English. If I say, she went to the kitchen to make a peanut butter and jelly blank, You already know the last word in that sentence, even though I didn't say it. Your brain made an implicit prediction. You weren't even involved. You simply know. Even if you tried not to understand what I was saying, I promise you, you would still understand what I was saying because your brain simply uses recognition. Again, no conscious thinking step. And that only comes from authentic experiences in the language, listening to the language at a level you understand. And these unconscious predictions, it's not just about the words in the immediate sentence. Let me give you another example. If I say, Voldemort is an evil wizard, Voldemort is in the room with the protagonist, and then I say this sentence, Voldemort raised his blank and blanked a blank at blank. You actually can understand that sentence really well, even though there's nothing in it, because your brain is using pieces of the narrative to understand what it's looking at all times. So when we're trying to train ourselves for real-time comprehension, just trying to get super fast recall on meanings of words and meanings of sentences, that's not helping. We have to be training ourselves to make these unconscious predictions. And unconscious predictions require tons of authentic exposure, not recalling the meaning of isolated language fragments. And it's kind of a feedback loop because that same context that helps you understand the message also is pouring meaning into all of the words you're seeing. That's why just listening to the language is so efficient. You're constantly pouring tons of context into what you're hearing. So then why do I have flashcards as C tier and not as D tier or F tier? And the reason is because I think flashcards are a good, jumping off point, right? Like you can use a flashcard to get a functional starting point for understanding a word. What I don't believe in is intensive drilling. I think once you have a decent enough understanding of the connection between, an image and a word in your target language, then there's no reason to try to speed up that recall, in my opinion. Then it becomes more of just importing that context into your input. All right, the next thing on the list is language learning content in your native language. And I'm going to give this a big fat D tier. These are channels that teach you about the language, that teach you grammar in the language, that have you drilling vocab in the language. And I think the big problem with this kind of content is it makes you feel like you're learning when you're really not. In my opinion, what you're doing when you're, getting these explanations is you're learning about the language, but you're not actually learning the language, right? You're not building your fluency, you're just building your rational understanding of how the language works. And that can make you more comfortable when you listen to input for sure, but it's not essential to actually growing in your fluency. If you think being able to use words out loud or being able to recall words demonstrates a deep understanding of the language, I want to push back on that. Just because you can say some words you heard in a YouTube video or you can repeat a grammar rule doesn't actually mean you have a deep understanding of the language. The only way to get a deep understanding of the language, as we know, is listening to the language. That's the only way you can do it. A lot of times what people do, and this definitely happened to me, is they watch language learning content because they're scared of jumping into listening, right? I look at language learning content as standing on the outside of the pool, not wanting to jump in, right? You're like, oh, I don't really want to jump in. It's too uncomfortable. But my advice is to just jump in. I would challenge anybody who watches this content to just start watching it in your target language. That would be super helpful because then you could actually build your fluency while at the same time, learning about grammar if that actually interests you. In my opinion, this language learning content actually does become more useful down the line. If you're an intermediate or a high beginner or maybe even advanced, you're already going to have a very intuitive understanding of grammar. So if somebody explains some grammar rules to you, you're going to be like, oh, and then you can use those grammar rules to kind of fill in the gaps while you speak, right? When you're getting into the speaking phase, these are, a little bit more helpful. But in the absolute beginner phase, again, I just don't think you should prioritize speaking. You will pick up grammar the same way you pick up words, by making tons of associations in the language, right? Just by making the association that when someone's talking about themselves, they tend to use these types of verbs, etc. And of course, you can learn a grammar rule whenever you want, but you're not going to be able to unconsciously apply it intuitively until you get massive amounts of input. But if you're wondering what's even worse than language learning content, I have an interesting method for you. Traditional language learning class. This is going to get a big fat F. Paying to go to a class or getting on a wait list to get into a class where they teach you explicit grammar, they teach you translations, they want you to speak from day one, all of these tropes of the traditional language learning classes that a lot of us had to do in high school. That's what this is. The reason this gets an F is because it's just a strict downgrade from language learning content. Because in this model, you have to pay, or you have to go somewhere, you gotta drive somewhere, you gotta wait on a wait list for 3 months to get into some class, and you say to yourself,
well, I can't start learning a language until I get into this class.
And that is such a toxic mindset. If language learning content is you standing on the edge of a pool not wanting to jump in, then traditional language learning class is like waiting for your mom to drive you to the pool. It's like one step further of stalling. A lot of the philosophy of traditional language learning is that what you're going to do is you're going to get translations, you're going to get grammar rules, and you're going to get really fast at constructing sentences and decoding sentences when you hear them. And again, this is just the antithesis of what we're trying to do when we're learning a language. Again, I always like to say that it helps you in the beginning get comfortable, but at the end of the day, me as a fluent speaker, I am not just a really fast decoder and encoder, right? When I'm speaking, I'm not constructing English sentences in my head and then translating them into Spanish. And when I'm listening, I'm not like on the fly translating. I just recognize what's being said. That is the ultimate goal. I know I've said this 100 times, but for absolute beginners, it's very important to understand this. We have to cut our native language out of the equation. We're just gonna listen in Spanish and we're gonna speak in Spanish, or whatever language you're learning. The way I like to explain this on the channel is that language learning isn't a rational set of facts in your head. Someone explaining to you how to understand a language is like someone explaining to you what it feels like to put your hand over fire. If you've never put your hand over fire, no one's going to be able to explain to you that feeling. You have to experience it for yourself. Same thing with language. No one can explain language learning to you. You just have to experience it. And I understand that a lot of absolute beginners want some explicit instruction. Totally fine. Let me recommend you this next method. I think the best way to get explanations, translations, and all that good stuff as efficiently as possible is LLMs. LLMs like ChatGPT are B tier. Imagine I told you in 2021 that I had a language learning app that could generate infinite amounts of your target language in text. It could answer basically any question about the language. It could talk to you in the language you want to learn. You would say that's the best language learning app ever made. ChatGPT is that app in my opinion, so I recommend that every language learner take advantage of it. Ask it any question about grammar, ask it to translate any word or sentence, ask it to explain the definition of a word or a sentence to you in your target language. You can do written crosstalk, meaning you can text in English and it can respond to you in your target language. You can now even do crosstalk in voice mode. You can get any explanation you need on demand. You could even have it generate stories for you tailored to your exact interests. In my opinion, it's the single most effective app to help you learn a language outside comprehensible input platforms like YouTube or Dreaming Spanish or my website Langualytics. And the only reason it doesn't get an A is because you lack that human element. At the end of the day, we're humans. We want to connect with humans. If you've watched my other videos, you know I talk a lot about parasocial connections. It's really important that you feel a kind of relationship with the people you're watching, because emotional connection creates durable memory, right? So instead of having to do spaced repetition and hack your way into your brain remembering something, instead of doing that, what we're going to do is we're going to take advantage of the fact that our brains already store our most emotionally charged memories. Nothing is going to stick for you as well as stuff you hear from someone you actually care about. Now, this is coming from me, who had a girlfriend in the language for a long time, and it's true. A lot of the stuff she said is the stuff that stuck with me the most, and you can kind of replicate this online with comprehensible input creators. I definitely did that as well. I can't oversell that. I think that's super important, and I think a lot of people's mistake in language learning is thinking they're just going to try to cram information, but they're not thinking about durability, right? You don't really want to brute force your way to understanding a language. Instead, what you want to do is you want to take advantage of how our mind naturally remembers, and how our mind naturally remembers is compelling emotional experiences. As an absolute beginner, it's not going to be super easy to get those, but if you watch specific comprehensible input creators and you kind of grow with them, you start watching them more and more, you'll definitely unlock this. Anybody in the comment section who's taken this journey can definitely confirm what I'm saying. All right, the next method on the list is a method that I'm only including because I want to steer people in the right direction, and this method is shadowing. Shadowing gets an F tier. The idea of shadowing is you turn on a native speaker and you listen to them talk and you try to simultaneously talk with them. You're trying to imitate the intonation, the rhythm, etc. Get yourself a good native accent. And what I'm gonna say is, for absolute beginners, even up to the intermediate phase, this is just not necessary. You're solving a problem you just don't have yet. Pronunciation, like almost everything else in language learning, 90% of that is just gonna come from input. I would say input is the ordinary means of improving your accent. It's the ordinary means. It's usually what you should do. If you're struggling to speak sounds in the language, 90% of the time you just need more input. I'm gonna stand on my experience here. I'm gonna post a clip of me speaking Spanish below. It's like a 12-minute clip so you can hear how I sound. I've never done any accent training or any focus on my accent, and I think I sound perfectly fine. Am I perfect? Probably not, but I think I sound perfectly fine. What I've noticed is that the people with the worst accents are the people who started speaking really early and practiced a lot of speaking early before they really understood how the language sounded. And what I'm not saying is that shadowing is useless. I know shadowing has applications in speech pathology, so when you're trying to get people to stop stuttering, or singers and actors will use shadowing to try to replicate accents. So this has scientific backing. It can help you with your accent. All that I'm saying is you really shouldn't do this in the beginning, and you should only really do this if your accent really sucks for some reason and input isn't working, or you're just really, really interested in having a perfect accent, which I think the majority of language learners aren't super concerned with. If you're like me, you're more concerned with comfortable, fluid listening as opposed to sounding impressive when you speak. I don't really care if I sound impressive. A lot of the time when I'm speaking Spanish, it's not to impress people. It's just to communicate, be understood, and have a good time. And I want to throw something in the end here for absolute beginners to wrap their head around how input helps your pronunciation. One of the ways is that when we're watching comprehensible input, our mind is unconsciously focusing on the speaker's mouth. You probably won't notice this, but you'll be unconsciously focusing on the speaker's mouth, and when you go to speak, you're going to move your mouth in the same way unconsciously. It's kind of weird when you first notice it, but I think this is how we get an intuition for how to move our mouths to make sounds in different languages. We're gonna have another F right after that F, and this is gonna be language exchange. Now let me be really clear about what language exchange means to me. It means you're speaking your target language and somebody else is correcting you. And the idea of this method is that we're gonna learn to speak our target language one correction at a time, right? We're gonna say something wrong, someone's gonna correct us, then we're gonna learn, say it again, be corrected again until we speak perfectly. Now, this again is antithetical to how I look at how to learn a language. I personally think that you probably shouldn't be speaking until at least 50 hours, probably more like 150 hours, because you just don't know what you're saying. When you're in the early stages, you're not practicing speaking, you're just parroting. You're just learning to parrot the language. You're not actually using your deep understanding of the language to produce. Instead, you're just doing what a parrot does, right? When a parrot speaks, it doesn't know what it's saying. That's basically what you're doing at an early stage if you're trying to practice speaking. I think something that gets lost on beginners is the actual relationship between understanding and speaking. What I'm going to say is speaking, actual fluent, authentic, unconscious speech comes from deep understanding. So deep understanding is what we're building, and listening and speaking both come out of that. I understand for a certain subset of people, language exchange feels really intuitive because the idea is to improve at anything you need feedback. But the thing is, with language learning, feedback doesn't come from verbal correction. When you take in input, you're not just adding new information. Your brain is constantly taking its current understanding of the language and comparing it with whatever you hear next. That's where this unconscious prediction comes into play. You're constantly updating your brain's ability to unconsciously predict what's coming next by taking in more input. Imagine you're learning English, and every time you hear the word famous is referring to somebody who's well-dressed. So you might make the reasonable assumption that famous means well-dressed. But then imagine you hear the word famous, and the person being described as famous is wearing pajamas. At first, nothing happens because one example isn't going to overturn 100. But then you hear the word famous 1,000 more times in a variety of contexts, and slowly the real meaning of the word becomes statistically overwhelming. This is the ordinary means by which we correct ourselves in language learning. Again, I said the ordinary means. That means 90% of the time this is what happens. Of course, there are exceptions. One method that I don't hear talked about a lot is transcription. And I'm going to give transcription a B. Transcription is when you watch a video in your target language and you write down what you're hearing in your target language. and then you use that video's transcript or subtitles to check your work. Once you finish watching a video and you go back and check how you did, you can see the sounds that are still not clear to you and work on getting, a good grasp of those sounds. When you first start a language, part of the overwhelm is you're not just learning new words, you're learning new sounds. And what I think transcription does really well is it gives you a feel for the sounds. It lets you just focus on the sounds before you even care about what the words actually mean. This is why I think it's a good absolute beginner exercise. And when you do transcription, you also learn the writing system at the same time. Obviously, you can only do this exercise with some languages. You have to choose a phonetic language, so something like Mandarin is off the table, and languages like English and French are a bit harder because they're semi-phonetic, but a language like Spanish or Italian or Portuguese are really great for this. The reason this is a B tier is because I don't think it's necessary, so I don't want you to think you have to do this. I just think this exercise really helped me. A lot of people might not like the intensity of it. I did. I thought this was a really great way to focus on specifically, getting a feel for the sounds. A practical note on this one is you're gonna need to do this with videos that have manual subtitles, because auto-generated subtitles on YouTube aren't gonna work for this because they're too imprecise. You need manual subtitles, or you could come to my site and generate a transcript. The transcripts on my site are done by Whisper, and Whisper is a lot more powerful than the auto-generated subtitles on YouTube. So it's not as good as manual, but it's probably really close. So I do think, my website is also a good option for this. Just like in all my tier lists, I tend to save the S tier for last, and what we're gonna put in the S tier is Crosstalk. If language exchange is the worst way to use another person to learn a language, Crosstalk is the best. Crosstalk is the actual way you should be utilizing people around you to help you learn. Crosstalk is when two people speak, but they both speak their own native language. So if I'm an English speaker, I speak English, and if the person I'm talking to is a Spanish speaker, they speak Spanish. So it's the opposite of language exchange. It's an input-based exercise as opposed to an output-based exercise. The biggest issue with almost every single method on this list is that they're online learning, right? The videos you're watching, you can't interact with them. You can't slow them down. You can't tell them to stop. You can't ask them to explain something. You kind of just have to work with them. But with Crosstalk, what you say influences what they say, right? So you get a really personalized, natural conversation that you're actually interested in. Sometimes it's really hard to find comprehensible input videos that you're actually interested in. But if you have a Crosstalk partner, you're part of the conversation. You get to guide where the conversation goes. A lot of times also in comprehensible input videos, we're not actually talking about things that happen in our daily lives. But when you crosstalk, there's a lot more overlap with the things you actually talk about in your daily life, and this is going to make you feel so much more fluent, right? Because if you're only kind of conversing and talking about things that you actually care about, well, you're going to feel much more fluent in your daily life because you're like, oh, well, I can kind of manage these situations faster in my target language now. This is part of why kids seem to learn so fast, because the words they learn, the stuff they're learning in the language is intimately tied with what's actually going on in their lives, right? Because the language is a barrier between understanding people trying to communicate with them in their actual life, whereas online learning doesn't really do that as well. Also in this video, I've mentioned the importance of emotional connection, and Crosstalk is simply the best way to emotionally connect because you're literally connecting with another person. You're having a conversation. It's not a parasocial relationship, it's an actual relationship, which is just obviously going to be better than a parasocial relationship where it's only one direction. This is a two-directional thing. And I want to be clear that Crosstalk isn't just immersion. It's not just somebody speaking fast at you and you're trying to fumble through what they're saying. It's somebody who's adjusting themselves to your level so you can understand them. And a lot of crosstalk features drawing pictures or trying to explain things in really basic ways. I think it's a great way to learn a language. I think it's the most efficient way to learn a language. And if you're trying to get functionally fluent as fast as possible, this is the way. If you can find a crosstalk partner, that is simply the way to do it. So that is the absolute beginner language learning method tier list. I hope you enjoyed it. I recommend you check out my website, Langualytics, if you are an absolute beginner, because you can find these comprehensible input videos there with transcription tools, with translation tools. I will see you in the next video.